series on how to teach people to become Christians. And all you have to do is just look through the film strip, follow the booklet, and by these lessons you can help a person know what was important about the Bible, teaching them about Christ, and how to become a Christian. And the first Bible study I ever had, I used that film strip. And I used it a few other times and other occasions, and it only varied from that after going to Argentina because they didn't have anything in Spanish, number one, and I wouldn't have been able to answer questions in Spanish, number two. So we just read the Bible together. But that film strip, at the very beginning, at least I remember number one, as it was talking about the creation and had the background song of what we just sang here, "This is my Father's world." Then the next phrase says, "And to my listening ears." I think it's good for us to have our ears open, to be reminded that this is God's world, not anybody else's. It's not our church, it's God's church. And that I'm His servant, and that everything that I do should be focused in that direction. Verse 2 says, "The birds their carols raise." And then verse 3 says, "Oh, let me ne'er forget that though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet. This is my Father's world. The battle is not done. Jesus who died shall be satisfied, and the earth and the heaven be won." I know we sang that, but just let those words sink deeply into your heart. What we do and where our focus is God. He's the ruler. He's the owner of this world. Tonight I wanted to look at Luke chapter 13 and go ahead and open to that, and we'll look at a parable that Jesus tells. It ties very closely into this concept of creation, which I was thinking of when we first sang this song. In Genesis chapter 1, as God is creating the world, and He creates the herbs and the grass of the field and the trees and all of those things, and He said that each one is created so that it produces seed after its own kind. And then in 1:22, after creating the animals, He gives them a command as if animals could understand, but it's there nonetheless. It's what God is going to expect. Be fruitful and multiply. Now, after the flood in Genesis chapter 8, when Noah steps off the ark and brings all of those animals off, or however they came out, again that comment is made by God to what's left of the earth. Be fruitful and multiply. Now, when we get down to what's going on in Luke chapter 13, there's something not working right among God's people. And Jesus addresses it in a parable. Chapter 13, verses 6 to 9. And He spoke this parable. A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. Then he said to the keeper of the vineyard, "Look, for 3 years I have come seeking fruit on this tree and find none. Cut it down. Why does it use up the ground?" But he, the keeper now, answered and said to him, "Sir, let it alone this year also, until I dig around it and fertilize it. And if it bears fruit, well. But if not, after that you can cut it down." Now, there's not really an ongoing debate between the owner and the keeper of the vineyard, but rather just a discussion that Jesus happens to add into that to give us a little bit more understanding about this concept of bearing fruit. I read some years ago about a missionary, and I've heard him speak a few different times, named David Chadwell. Went to Africa years ago. And after being there, he was not only impressed with the people and all that, but being somewhat of a farmer, he was also impressed with the rich ground that they had in the area where he lived.
So when he went back home on one of his furloughs, being a person that liked to have extra ground and plant things and all this, he gathered up tomato seeds and I don't know what all else, fruits and things, and thought, this is going to be fabulous. I'm going to go back and I'm going to have me a little plot of ground and we're going to really produce some homegrown stuff like I had back home in my place in Africa, and I'll really feel at home. So he got there, and of course, as you can imagine, is talking to all the people and telling him about the plants, or the seeds at least, that he's bringing, and how this is going to be such a great thing. And as he planted the seeds and began watering, things were starting to produce, and he was excited and enthused, and as the plants grew, they were even bigger than what he had in the States, which didn't surprise him because the land was very fertile. So with a lot of enthusiasm and excitement, he explained to all the locals just how great this is going to be, and maybe describing, I'm envisioning some of this, I don't remember all the story, but telling the people of what this is going to taste like and how neat it's going to be. And then to his sad time after that, none of it produced. Huge plants, much bigger than stateside, but not one blossom, not one bloom, not one bit of fruit came from any of the plants that he planted. Well, not only was he a little bit despondent because he really missed the homegrown tomatoes and the corn and all these other things, but he was a bit embarrassed as he was explaining to the local people how great this is going to be, and it's even greater than it was back home, and what these plants are going to taste like, and they're watching and waiting, and nothing happened. So he's a bit discouraged about it. Well, that is a parallel that he uses to tell the story as he unfolds the discussion that I see here in Luke 13. As Jesus is telling the parable, he's describing a situation of what God is seeing as he looks down on his earth. Now, as God is looking out, he's saying to himself, this is my Father's world. I have set things in motion, and I've described things to the rest of the world that they fully understand. Be fruitful and multiply. And yet somewhere in this process, spiritually speaking, his people were missing the point about the importance of not only looking good and looking tall and all of those things, but actually being able to produce after its own kind. And so thus, Jesus tells the parable. Now, this isn't the only parable, of course, that discusses the importance of us being busy at work doing God's business. Was read just a little bit ago from Jason here, from Matthew chapter 25, a segment of the parable of the talents, in which Jesus once again, now at the end of his ministry, tells a story where an owner gives basically 3 servants a commission to take care of some things for him. And each one is given a sum of money, which is described as a talent of money. That was a weight of gold, according to the person's ability. And so one got more than another, and one got a whole lot more, and the final guy just got one small sum. But each one got something with to do, according to the ability that he had. And if you've read that parable, you'll remember the first part of it we did read a while ago, that the first guy that came back, who had the most talents, came back and had produced more talent. He didn't come back just with the 5. He didn't squander it. He didn't waste it, but he produced even more than that. And if you remember then the 2 or the 3 talent man, depending on your firmness in the parable, he comes back and he's also produced twice as much as what the owner of the land had given him. But that final guy is the one that's the problem, I guess, a problem child, you might say, in that. The discussion that Jesus was really aiming at, and again, it's focused back on God's people. Now, in that day and time, there were a lot of leaders in God's kingdom that weren't doing the work. They were looking good. They were described in Matthew 23 as whitewashed sepulchres, which shine brightly on the outside and had all kinds of description of being honorable and fine, but on the inside, best description, Jesus says, full of dead man's bones. Nothing happening inside that would produce any kind of change in the life of an individual. The person that was hired that had the 1 talent didn't come across as a person that was honorable. And as you remember, the parable was telling it that Jesus said that the talent not only was taken away from him, but there was a condemnation that was given. Reasonable amount of equipment given to a person of ability, and thus he's hired. And Jesus gives a description not too long time-wise after that event. Remember, the parable's told now toward the end of Jesus' ministry. Subsequently, after that, he dies. He's resurrected by the power of God, as God had always planned. And then just before he returns to heaven, he gives his apostles, and that is to be passed on to us, what's commonly called as the Great Commission. Jesus talks in Matthew 28, and Matthew pens the words that says, "Go and make disciples of all nations." Now, when you look at that and compare to what is being described here as far as producing fruit, we understand that we're recreating something after our own kind. As disciples of Jesus, we're called on to produce more disciples. It's not a job that's given just to leaders of the kingdom. That is only to apostles. But as when we look in the book of Acts and we'll see the description of what the church is doing and how it grows, we immediately see that, yes, the apostles are involved in leading and directing and coordinating things, but when the church hits persecution, we're seeing very quickly that when they're scattered abroad, according to Acts chapter 8, it says the people went everywhere preaching the message. Therefore, they understood that this commission that Jesus gave in Matthew 28, we can say of producing more fruit, wasn't just a commission for the apostles, but is one that any Christian could fully understand and do so. They went everywhere preaching the gospel, what it says in Acts chapter 8. Now, I want to notice here in the parable here about what's happening here. Luke chapter 13, verses 6 through 8. The parable describing the man in his vineyard. He plants it. He comes seeking fruit on it, finds none. But verse 7 says, the keeper of the vineyard calls for, I guess, a little extra patience. Look here, for 3 years I've been coming on this tree, and I've found no fruit. And he's ready to cut it down, but the response back in verse 7 is, but let's let it one more year go, the keeper says. God has an extreme amount of patience with us in a lot of ways, for which I'm truly grateful, as I'd be long gone if that were not the case. He's patient in us making sure that we do things that we ought to be doing and not do the things that we ought not to be doing. And he gives us maybe more latitude than I should fairly be given. But as we're looking at time here, God's saying, I'm going to be patient with you up to a point. And maybe someone else will intercede and I'll be a little more patient. But the end of the whole process is that there's still a reckoning that God is expecting out of us in producing fruit. The one-talent man, by the way, in Matthew chapter 25, when it got down to the point of his discussion with the master, and he came back and he gave that one talent back to the master, I find his response rather judgmental of a God that is patient and kind. The parable says, I knew you were a hard man, and you sowed where you didn't reap, and therefore I buried your talent. God is not a God like that. And as we're looking at the patience and the love of God, we also need to remember what he expects out of us in producing fruit. And you think, why in the middle of what we might call getting into Christmas season do we talk about these things? Well, one is I think it fits well to who we are as Christians no matter what time of the year and where our thinking might be. But maybe you are looking toward not just what's happening with Christmas, but are with anticipation looking toward what's happening in January. I am. And what I would like to see for myself being done this year as a minister, for our congregation to be able to participate in bringing itself up even higher in praise to God. And as I look toward that, I think we can't set all our goals on one lesson on January 1st or whenever that Sunday falls and comes to us, and the whole thing can't hinge on that. But rather, I think this is a time for us to be preparing ourselves for the goals that we need to be making. That we're not just quickly jotting down a few things, rehearsing what we've been doing over the last few years and never completing, but rather very methodically, very prayerfully, and very cautiously analyzing who we are as Christians, what God expects, among the other things that we might be doing for our life. And very seriously looking at, what does God want? And how much more time, how many more years do I have in His service? And so therefore, it really is a good time to consider that, if you are of the mindset as many, to be setting goals in January. Let's look at one more thing here before we close the lesson out. I'm going to make it short intentionally tonight. I know it's been a long day for a lot of people, and you've done a lot, but let's look at one more thing along the lines of producing fruit. But this one's in Galatians. A little different perspective, but it talks about fruit nonetheless. Galatians chapter 5. After a little bit of discussion in Paul's letter, as he's writing about things that don't fit in Christianity, he talks about the works of the flesh, and he sees those things that are very evident in the life of people in the world. He turns around and he describes what would be a Christian, a true Christian, but he takes it from this angle. Verse 22, he says, the fruit of the Spirit. And maybe you have sung that song and therefore have memorized love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And I whiz through that, but we'll take it with time in just a moment. But as we're looking at that, that is the product, singular, fruit. Although there's several things listed there, 7 of them if I recall correctly. It's who we are inside. This is the fruit of when the Spirit is dwelling in us. When we've got God in our heart, reigning in there, this is the product. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And against such things as that, Paul goes on and writes, there's not a law against it, because that is the product of who we are as Christians. Now, when I think about the two things, and both of them using that concept of fruit, I'm seeing one that is a product that develops within us, and the other is the product of what happens when we're like that on the inside. It's just the natural consequence. If we have these things within us, I think it's going to be hard to hold back producing fruit. Other disciples. People are going to naturally want to have what we have. Now, I didn't bring a box of fruit up here and have all the, but if I had, and you would have seen all the, after a while of listening to me, you'd be looking at the fruit thinking, I want some of that. Especially if you're a little bit dry after taking sinus medicine, whatever, like some of you probably have been over the last several days. And fruit really looks luscious in a dry setting. In a world that is so spiritually just destitute, dry and dead bones, sharp, crisp, bright-colored fruit just looks great. When we have that kind of product inside us as individuals, and when our response is like Jesus' response, when the world is not doing the things it ought to be doing, we stand out. And along the line, people see that and say, I'm interested in that. And they may not come to you, but they might. But if they don't, it still gives you power to talk to them. An evidence that there's something going on inside you that's worth having. And when you bring it up, they say, I want that. I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about that. That they will seek you out because that is something they really want to have, because to the rest of the world, when they look at it, really isn't going the right way. So as we're seeing these things, I want you to think about where we're at as Christians. December the 8th, I believe it is today. And we have just a few more weeks to deal with Christmas holidays and enjoying family and doing different things and pondering also, what am I going to do come January 1? And what things do I want to do differently? 2 goals, all related to fruit. Thinking about the inside, what product am I producing and what can I do to be a bit better in the time, however long it is, that God's given me. And then in that whole thing, just somewhere in this year, God, would you give me an opportunity to help reproduce? Now, it's dependent on God to be able to do that, but it's depending on you to be willing to do that. I don't know, but I'm just really confident from what I read in the Scriptures that any time we've got somebody that's willing to teach the Scriptures, God brings someone to you. Doors open. Now, they may not come knocking at your door. I've had that happen, seeking things, but that's mainly because they knew I was a minister. But nonetheless, I think opportunities open up for young and old, and I think some of these college kids can speak for that because they've done some of those things. Each one of us, one person this year, striving to do that. And maybe you can, maybe you can't produce something. We'll let God work those things out. But remember the striving that we're to do to produce fruit. Some goals worth considering as we think about this year and who we are. Some time ago, we had a little brochure printed up about spiritual growth. And again, this is something aiming toward goals of who you are inside. Maybe you've lost your little pamphlet. I've kept mine in the back of my Bible and just reminding me about some things that I need to be doing. I've got one that's a lot more withered than this is inside my briefcase. It really has some notes written on it. But think about this, too, as we look toward this year and who we are as a Christian and what kind of growth He expects, and particularly related to these 2 goals. May God help us to be better, not more worn out, just better at being His servants. Tonight, as we close our lesson out, if you need prayers, if your life isn't right, if your fruit is rotten within and you know it, or your life's just caving in, you need help, or you never became a Christian, look to your life, and if it's not right, come make it right. While we sing, please come.